Thanks so much, Rebecca. Thanks to the organizers for inviting us to this unique conference. And also thanks for scheduling us as a follow-up presentation after Liana, who just perfectly introduced also our main topic. Also, we will be talking about tensions that have arisen recently due to cultural, macro-cultural changes. And we will try to reflect on maybe with a bit more focus on practical responses and sort of answer to the same questions Liana just discussed from a design-oriented perspective. If you want to look into our slides during or after the talk, you see the shortcut here, and we will present it also once more in the end. Right, and with this, let's just shortly summarize our thesis outline. Also, we start from the fact that we frequently do work in developing websites, apps, or interfaces to claim data, and we often do this with a rather local focus and also an hopefully optimistic and idealistic attitude, which is good because we have enough technical problems to solve. However, in this talk, we want to explore the value of looking at the macro-cultural landscape and its recent developments realistically, including rather dark accounts on the advent of the so-called dopamine culture. We assume that we rarely have the time to do so during our challenging projects, but we consider it valuable to discuss them mainly with regard to possible responses and reactions. And so in the second part of our talk, we will cycle through 5 of them. The dopamine dilemma, we assume, comes from a lot of ready-made technological solutions which are available, but which have certain drawbacks. Mainly, they don't make a big impact in the dopamine culture and for respective audiences, versus using appealing high-cost designs, maximizing impact, but maybe producing just rather shallow forms of processing. There are 3 interesting in-between scenarios, including the promotion of cognition-supporting designs, where, for example, data visualization can play a central role, but also slow, reflective, or critical designs. And as a 5th option, we want to shortly reflect on, we call it the museo-therapeutic positions, where you either resist deliberately to the digital transformation or choose some so-called post-digital designs, which mainly try to strengthen on-site immersion. So, while Liana has already provided us with a very useful understanding of the recent shifts, we shortly summarize them here, also giving you an impression by providing you with multiple actual media channels on the left and the right. We start from the rise of digital platforms, which we knew strengthen the diffusion of content on every level, and they transformed attention into a key commodity, with business competing systematically to capture and monetize user engagement. The dopamine culture now would be the accumulation of designs and technologies exploiting dopamine driving and dopamine driven behaviors, fostering instant gratification and long-term addiction. For example, endless scrolling, gratification farming, and disruptive notifications. The attention economy then would be the larger landscapes where platforms monetize, mine, and even frack users' attentions by prioritizing content that maximizes engagement, often through sensationalism, antagonism, or algorithms favoring personalized short-term appeal. This changes consumption habits, and that's why it's relevant for everyone designing content for the web. It reshapes individual expectations and collective consumption habits towards rapid, high stimulation content over depth. Attention is trained by every user to crave novelty, and this reduces the ability to engage with long-form or reflective media. There is a whole range of societal impacts, and these trends reshape whole societal fields, such as politics, obviously, education, relationships, but also it unfolds a massive impact on culture. And here we want to shift to one specific blog post by Ted Gioia, a cultural critic, and who just assembled a very impressive sketch of this actual shift, we can just encourage you to read it, but we will also provide you with an extensive quote here. And he starts from this metaphor visualization that sort of represents the eternal struggle between art and entertainment. And we know that art seeks to provoke thought, challenge perspectives, convey deep emotions and ideas in innovative and authentic ways. But since the dawn of modernity, it's infringed on and overshadowed by entertainment, which aims primarily to amuse, to engage, or provide pleasure in a more immediate and accessible way, appealing to broad audiences and promising a greater return of investment. So this is the known scenario, also where cultural critique usually sets in the 20th century. The Frankfurt School has discussed it from various angles, and also Liana has pointed us to it. Now there comes an upgrade from Ted Gioia in his blog article, The State of Culture, How Silicon Valley Views Culture. He writes, the fastest growing sector of the culture economy actually is distraction, or call it scrolling or swiping or wasting time or whatever you want, but it's not art or entertainment, just ceaseless activity. The key is that each stimulus only lasts a few seconds and it must be repeated. It's a huge business and will soon be larger than arts and entertainment combined. Everything is getting turned into TikTok, and aptly named platform for a business based on stimuli that must be repeated after only a few ticks of the clock. This is more than just a hot trend. It can last forever because it's based on body chemistry, not fashion or aesthetics. Our brain rewards these brief bursts of distraction. The neurochemical dopamine is released, and this makes us feel good, so we want to repeat the stimulus. So you need to ditch that simple model of art versus entertainment, and even distraction is just a stepping stone towards the real goal nowadays, which is addiction. The tech platforms aren't like the Medici in Florence or those other rich patrons who want to find the next Michelangelo or Mozart. They want to create a vault of junkies because they will be the dealers. Addiction is the goal. They don't say it openly, but they don't need to. Just look at what they do. The tech CEOs know this is harmful, but they do it anyway. Internal documents show how Instagram use leads to depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. Mark Zuckerberg was told all the disturbing details. He doesn't care. The CEOs all know the score. The more their tech gets used, the worse all the psychic metrics get. But still, they push aggressively forward. They don't want to lose market share to the other dopamine cartel members, and with a special focus on children. They figured out what every junk peddler already knows. It's more profitable to get users locked in while they are young. So we can just encourage you to read this blog post by yourself. It also contains some other pictures aside from these fish. For example, this diagram with which Gioia really details the development of dopamine culture across several phases. And then he writes, for this diagram, instead of movies, user gets served up an endless sequence of 15-second videos. Instead of symphonies, listeners hear bite-sized melodies, usually accompanied by one of these tiny videos, just enough for a dopamine hit and no more. This is the new culture, and its most striking feature is the absence of culture with a capital C, or even mindless entertainment. Both get replaced by compulsive activity. Everything is gamified, anything can be scrollable, you can simulate any boat you row, but what does this do to our brains, to our lives, to the future? Here's where the science gets really ugly. The more addicts rely on these stimuli, the less pleasure they receive. At a certain point, this cycle creates anhedonia, the complete absence of enjoyment in experience supposedly pursued for pleasure. So we'll end the quote here, and we'll admit it sounds possibly quite bleak at the beginning, but we think also quite lucid. And it also is uncanny how it connects to current developments. We will look at what it does to image consumption, but it's also astonishing looking at recent event, how also politics is transformed into a third phase from the left, from the slow traditional culture. We still frequently think we are living in, to a new form of culture that is highly accelerated and just plays along new rules. So I will do a short digression here and just point you to a current blog by Ezra Klein from the New York Times, where he just neatly follows up what we have just diagnosed for culture. He writes, "Attention isn't just endangered, it's the world's most valuable resource, and the people who are on top on the world right now understand its value. If there is going to be a successful opposition to them, that opposition is going to need to understand its value and understand how to wield it. And right now, it doesn't." And then he mentioned that at some point, we hope to see a candidate come up who is going to weaponize this current feeling of disgust about what an immersive, manipulative political attention economy and dopamine culture is doing to us. And he considers that these candidates will not run against specific companies, Facebook or Meta as a big company, but they will going to run against all of it, that society and modernity and politics shouldn't feel like this. Right, so we can also just encourage you to maybe listen into this podcast between Ezra Klein and Chris Hayes, but we will return to our reflections about culture, because until politics starts to fight against these detrimental developments, it's either up to us as individuals to respond to these threats or to us as institutions. So also Ted Gioia doesn't provide us with only a bleak diagnosis, but he summarizes options to actually escape dopamine culture as an individual, for example, by deliberately limiting our exposure to these technologies, by engaging in deep, uninterrupted activities, by cultivating mindfulness and reflection, and by fostering real-world connections. Also by supporting and creating meaningful art, establishing tech-free zones, and educating ourselves and others about the effects of this transformation. So, and we want to go on from these individual measures to institutional responses and talk about what we call the dopamine dilemma, which is, given all these changes, usually just using standard technology isn't enough. It's cheap, and sometimes we still sort of have to use standard technology, and it's better to have something online than nothing. But we know the impact that standard interfaces can make in this advanced dopamine culture is just limited. On the other side would be the use of high-class technology, which is expensive and attractive, but also possibly deforming regarding the original intents which art museums start from. So we will discuss these two options, but also in between 3 different alternatives, including cognition-supporting designs, reflective designs, and a 5th option that would be to resist actual use of digital technology and design museums as a non- or post-digital retreat. Just to sum up, on the right-hand side, you see these reflections can sound rather bleak and pessimistic, but I think they are a valuable counterweight to starting too naively, too optimistically, and to just produce non-sustainable digital transformations because you actually don't reach your audiences because they are expecting already some other kind of rapid entertainment. And with this, we will go into these 5 strategies with a bit more detail, and I'm handing over to Eva Mayr for this part.
Thank you. So what could be the first strategy? We could just go on as usual and bring things online by means of our standard interface technologies. How do they usually look like? Usually we have got standard museum database systems, which provide a search-centered interface, generate lists or grids of objects, and details on these objects on demand. But if we want immediate satisfaction, such interfaces will not serve the user's need. They are lacking user experience, they are less attractive, they don't provide immediate insights, and they don't give an overview on what is in this database or in that museum, but would be worth digging deeper. So we need some other ways to go. Another one could be to jump on and use this kind of dopamine technologies, so that we have got these high UX technologies, these fast technologies. We can post frequently on TikTok and have got the TikTok community, the other social media communities as followers to our institutions. But will that also bring them into our museums or help them to reflect on our collections? We could also have high user experience design for media, for example, with immersion or augmented reality. For example, we found an app where you could take a selfie with a dinosaur so that you would also post some impressions from your visit to a museum, but will that lead you to reflect on that dinosaur? I guess not. And I'm very thankful it's a very high cost to develop such technologies, and usually it's not easy to do that. They usually also depend on the platforms and on algorithms, and they really distract from the original objects so that people will not really interact with those objects deeply. So this hedonic experience is more important than critical or reflective thought oftentimes. And yesterday, Annette Löseke also presented the Pergamon Museum, this wonderful 360-degree immersive experience. And in the discussion afterwards, someone asked, doesn't that inhibit maybe a critical approach by the participants? And the answer was, well, critically done, they may cater to today's communication and interpretation practices and attract existing and new visitors. So we have to think about how we design such technologies, how we support critical cognition. As such, another strategy is to support cognition by maximizing the number of insights for the attention we give to the objects and to the technology. And our approach is to develop collection visualizations. And you might remember that picture from one of our last talks here at that conference, where we developed distant and scalable views on cultural collections. I give some examples here and feel free to explore them in the slides, but given the time, I'm going to show you only one of those examples, which is on a library collection, the Bibliotheca Eugeniana, which is featured in the Austrian National Library. And here at the center of the interface, you can see the actual library halls and the shelves, and can explore the collection on a temporal visualization on the right, so that you could see which of the books are from a given range of time. But you can also interact with this visualization and see, for example, the shelf in front of which you are standing. What kind of objects are there? What kind of books are there on art, for example? And you might find Vasari's book on historical book on artists, and directly look into that book and explore it and find Leonardo da Vinci there. So you can directly start to gain interest in the collection and follow your interest, and thereby engage with the collection more deeply. But we can go even deeper, and we can go into an in-depth reflection by means of reflective design. We heard already that reflective design is a methodology that is frequently used in museums, and that is a standard technology, but not for digital technologies in the cultural sectors. Those usually do not use such methods of gaining more in-depth reflection on their topics. So in human-computer interaction, in the last years, there was this idea to come with slow reflective design. So we do not want to design for speed and convenience, but instead seek to encourage introspection and mindful attentiveness. What does that mean? There are some design strategies that have been suggested. For example, we can bring a temporal perspective so that we see that some objects have been discussed and interpreted differently over time, or we can bring in conversation with AI, as Liane showed in the last talk, or also with other visitors. We can bring in comparison to other objects, to other people. And we can bring in discovery so that we reflect on the data and on the digital objects that we show. For example, the library of missing data sets is an object in an exhibition, a real object that shows the limits of digitization. We usually have a lot of data and knowledge missing. We have got biased data, we have uncertain and contested data, and we have to contextualize this data and find ways to visualize and show these unseen aspects of cultural heritage, as Katrin Glinka phrased it in her paper. So that is an approach to really reflectively design technology and show such aspects of the cultural collections. A very easy, simple example is to have an app where visitors can post their questions and thoughts on an artwork and share it with other visitors so that you converse with others and get a better idea about their understanding and thereby a triggered reflection yourself. If we go beyond the single object, we can use collection visualizations to draw a patina of discussion. So use a discourse, as it is called in the community, and show what objects were highly discussed, highly criticized, which objects have been frequently visited over time, also looking back and forth, and where there are relations also in the collection. In the forthcoming paper, we are going to discuss how we can combine this kind of reflective design approaches with our cognition-supporting visualization approach, and how we can design visual interfaces in a way so that visitors will start to interpret and reflect on the collection, but also on the broader context and the historical aspects of that collection. And to find ways to do that in an attractive way is really challenging. So as a final and very different strategy, we could also say the developing of such technology is high in effort and very difficult. So why not just resist any technologies and say we want to have non-digital or post-digital designs in our exhibitions? There has been a study that showed that in a museum where there are no technologies, people experienced more awareness and reflected more on the exhibition, had less stress, and also came to the museum more often. So this seems to be also a very successful strategy in terms of gaining visitors. But this kind of detox and well-being is also an object of this museo-therapeutic approach that says if we interact with art, that helps us to also solve our problems and raise emotion, that the interaction raises emotions that helps us with problems of our daily life. And we currently have also a project here at our center, which is called the Healthy Museum, where we try to follow up on these ideas. But, and here I also want to refer back to yesterday's talk by Florian Windhager, we can also reject the visual technologies and use technologies in a way that is less disturbing our visual interaction with the artwork. So Florian even said we should make the technology invisible and a natural part of the visiting experience. So to sum up, we have got 5 different strategies, and they differ in terms of how much they focus on the object or on the technology, or give a focus on both of them. They are very different in terms of costs for the development, but also for getting someone to develop those for us. And they have got very different strengths and weaknesses in terms of how easy they will help us to manage the attraction of our visitors and help us to also fight against this dopamine dilemma that we are facing currently in the museum sector. So I will give over to Florian for a last call to action.
Right. With this, we just want to tie up and wrap things up by mentioning that this is a non-exhaustive draft requiring further discussion and attention. And I think we were just able to start to think about this topic, which is always in the second row and which is rarely sufficiently focused during all the usually tech-focused work. First and foremost, we consider it important to call attention to the increasing war for attention and to include discussions about institutional strategies into the development of digital interface and communication projects. Given the limited efforts GLAM institutions can commonly invest into such projects, we advocate for not overestimating the impact of standard technologies, but to develop targeted self-conscious responses and designs. And with that, we just want to thank you for listening and look forward to your responses. Thank you.